At just 22, Empress Chen Jiao, the woman who once held the highest power in the Han imperial court, was deposed, imprisoned, and forced to drink poison. From jeweled halls to utter disgrace, her fall came in an instant. Her death was not only the tragedy of a young woman, but also a chilling reminder of how fragile a woman's fate could be beneath the shadow of the throne. Chen Jiao was born into the illustrious Chen clan, one of the most influential families of the Western Han dynasty. Her lineage alone shaped her destiny long before she could speak or walk. In the Han court, family name was currency, and the Chen family's political ties made them indispensable to the imperial household. Her father, Chen Wu, was a trusted statesman, while her grandmother was none other than the powerful Princess Guantao, sister to Emperor Jing. This meant that Chen Jiao was not simply a child of privilege. She was born at the crossroads of power and expectation. From an early age, she was groomed to embody the virtues of an empress: grace, composure, and loyalty to the dynasty. Unlike common girls of her time, Chen Jiao's childhood was a calculated preparation for a role that most women could never dream of. Tutors schooled her in the Confucian classics, in poetry, and in the delicate art of palace etiquette. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was monitored and shaped by the court's expectations. She was not merely a girl. She was a vessel of dynastic ambition. The political marriage between Chen Jiao and Liu Che, the young emperor who would later be known as Emperor Wu of Han, was not born of affection, but of strategy. Yet even within this calculated arrangement, there was an illusion of closeness. Both were still in their teenage years, both raised under the watchful eyes of the court, and their union was hailed as a symbol of family unity. In the streets of Chang'an, whispers carried the story of the golden couple, the handsome young emperor and his radiant empress. To the common people, Chen Jiao was the epitome of fortune, a girl chosen by heaven to sit beside the son of heaven himself. But within the palace walls, her role was a cage. It came with privilege, yes, but it also came with a burden she could never escape. As empress, she represented stability. She was the living embodiment of the dynasty's continuity, tasked with bearing heirs who would secure the imperial bloodline. Yet fate, cruel as ever, denied her the very duty that her position demanded. In a court where fertility equaled power, Chen Jiao's inability to produce a son would plant the seeds of her downfall. Still, in her earliest years, there must have been moments of hope. Moments when the grand halls of the Weiyang Palace shimmered not as a prison, but as a promise. Her robes glistened with silk, her hairpins sparkled with jade, and her attendants bowed at every step. To the outside world, she seemed untouchable, draped in divine authority. But behind the embroidered curtains of her palace chamber, she remained a young woman, barely into adulthood, carrying the impossible weight of empire on her shoulders. In 141 BCE, when Liu Che ascended the throne as Emperor Wu of Han, the empire was on the cusp of transformation. Still a teenager, he inherited the dreams of a dynasty eager to expand its reach and solidify its power. Beside him, Chen Jiao was crowned empress, her life forever bound to his. Their marriage was celebrated as the union of two branches of the imperial family, a bond that would strengthen the throne against rival factions. It was not uncommon in the Han dynasty for cousins or distant relatives to wed. Bloodlines were deliberately intertwined to prevent outsiders from seizing influence. For the Chen family, this was the culmination of decades of maneuvering within court politics. At first, the young couple presented an image of harmony. They had grown up in similar circles, shared the same tutors, and were accustomed to the suffocating rituals of court life. To the public eye, their marriage was ideal. The son of heaven, wise beyond his years, and the empress, graceful and composed, a model of virtue. But beneath the glitter of ceremonies and the chants of court officials, cracks soon began to appear. The marriage, though politically sound, lacked the tenderness of mutual affection. Emperor Wu, ambitious and restless, sought adventure beyond the confines of the palace. He dreamed of expanding China's borders, of securing military victories that would etch his name into eternity. Chen Jiao, on the other hand, was tethered to the private world of the harem, her role defined by domesticity and childbearing. The imbalance between them was striking. While the emperor was free to pursue concubines, wars, and glory, the empress was bound by a single duty: to produce a male heir. When this did not happen, her position began to waver. Yet during the first years of their union, there were fleeting moments of companionship. Perhaps they laughed together as teenagers do, or perhaps they shared whispered conversations about their uncertain futures. History rarely records tenderness, but one can imagine that for a brief time, the two were simply young, hopeful, and vulnerable. Still, palace life was unforgiving. Behind every smile, there were eyes watching, scheming ministers, jealous consorts, and attendants eager to exploit weakness. Chen Jiao was both the most exalted woman in the empire and its most scrutinized. Any misstep could be used against her, and in the treacherous environment of the Han court, enemies multiplied quickly. Her marriage to Emperor Wu, instead of granting her lasting security, placed her in a storm. A single failure, the absence of an heir, would make her vulnerable to rivals, and in time, that vulnerability would prove fatal. In the grand chronicles of the Han dynasty, their union is often described in cold political terms. But beneath the official records lies the story of two teenagers thrust into roles they could neither control nor escape. Chen Jiao, crowned with jewels and burdened with expectations, stood at the edge of history's stage, already sensing, perhaps, how quickly adoration could turn into abandonment. In the early years of her reign as empress, Chen Jiao seemed untouchable. She held the highest female title in the Han dynasty, second only to the emperor himself. Every lady-in-waiting bowed to her, every concubine deferred to her rank, and every ritual of the court placed her at its glittering center. On the surface, she embodied everything a queen should be: elegant, composed, and powerful. Yet beneath the silk curtains of Weiyang Palace, a storm was gathering. The empress had one responsibility above all others: producing an heir. And this was the very task she failed to accomplish. While concubines in the palace began giving birth to sons and daughters, Chen Jiao's chambers remained silent, void of the cries of infants. In an imperial court where the future of the dynasty depended on bloodlines, her inability to conceive was a dangerous weakness. Whispers spread quickly. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed she lacked virtue or that heaven disapproved of her. These rumors were more than idle gossip. They were daggers pointed at her authority. The emperor, ambitious and consumed with his vision for expansion, grew impatient. Though he respected her position, his affection began to wander toward other women. The once central bond between them began to fade, and with it, Chen Jiao's influence started to slip through her fingers. Still, she did not surrender easily. She enforced palace protocol with an iron will, reminding the concubines and attendants that she was the one and only empress. Her seal, her authority, and her family's political power shielded her for a time. Ministers continued to show her respect, and the palace bowed to her commands. But no command could silence the reality of childlessness. In a court where motherhood equaled power, every child born to another woman was a threat. The halls of the harem became a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of jealousy, suspicion, and whispered curses. Chen Jiao's early reign, then, was both triumphant and tragic. Outwardly, she stood at the pinnacle of power. Inwardly, she must have felt the creeping weight of doom. Each passing year without an heir pushed her closer to the edge, and though she still wore the crown, the ground beneath her feet was already beginning to crack. As the years wore on, Chen Jiao's palace became less a sanctuary and more a prison. Her failure to bear children distanced her from Emperor Wu, whose attention increasingly drifted toward younger, fertile concubines. Where once she had been the center of his gaze, she now felt like a shadow, present but unseen. Loneliness is perhaps the most brutal punishment for a queen. In the great halls of the harem, surrounded by attendants and luxury, Chen Jiao found herself isolated. The women who once bowed to her now whispered behind her back. Their laughter echoed like knives, each birth in the palace a reminder of her own barrenness. Her jealousy, though human, became her undoing. She resented the concubines who flaunted their pregnancies, who carried themselves with the confidence that came from securing the emperor's favor. She resented the emperor himself, who no longer sought her company with the devotion he once pretended to give. And she resented fate, which had placed her on the throne only to strip her of the very tools to hold it. Historical records describe her as increasingly bitter, her temper sharp, her actions reckless. She quarreled with attendants, lashed out at rivals, and tried to cling to fragments of authority. The once graceful empress became a figure of ridicule, painted as unstable and desperate by those who sought her downfall. But what the chronicles rarely acknowledge is the humanity behind this decline. Chen Jiao was barely more than a girl when she was made empress. She had been trained to play a role, not to live a life. And now, stripped of affection and support, she faced the suffocating solitude of a palace that had turned against her. In her loneliness, she turned inward, perhaps whispering prayers, perhaps plotting ways to reclaim what she had lost. But every effort pushed her further from salvation. The more she fought to hold her place, the more isolated she became. Her story at this stage is not just one of jealousy, it is one of abandonment. A young woman, once promised the world, was left to wither in the shadows of the very palace that had once crowned her queen. By the time Chen Jiao had been empress for several years, her desperation was palpable. She had lost the emperor's affection, her rivals thrived, and her once unshakable position trembled like a candle in the wind. In her attempt to regain power, she became entangled in one of the most dangerous accusations of the Han dynasty: witchcraft. In ancient China, sorcery was not merely superstition, it was treason. To use spells or charms against an imperial consort, or worse, the emperor himself, was viewed as a direct attack on the throne. In the Han court, where political enemies lurked behind every curtain, rumors of witchcraft were the perfect weapon. It began with whispers, reports that Chen Jiao had sought out shamans and mediums, that she had buried dolls and written curses to harm her rivals in the harem. Whether true or fabricated, the allegations gained traction quickly. Her childlessness already made her vulnerable, and now she was painted as a woman desperate enough to call upon forbidden powers. For her enemies, this was the opportunity they had long awaited. Concubines who bore children, ministers with ambitions, and even eunuchs eager to rise in favor. Each had something to gain by seeing her fall. They seized on the charges, presenting them as undeniable proof of her unfitness to remain empress. to the emperor, the accusations cut deeply. Emperor Wu was a man obsessed with legitimacy and heaven's mandate. He believed his reign was sanctioned by divine will, and to tolerate sorcery within the palace would be to invite cosmic disaster. To discover that his empress might have resorted to such acts was not just a personal betrayal, but an existential threat to the empire's stability. Historical records suggest that Chen Jiao may have indeed dabbled in rituals, though whether out of superstition, desperation, or simple rumor remains unclear. What is certain is that once the word witchcraft entered the air, her fate was sealed. In a court where even the suspicion of sorcery could end careers, no one dared to defend her. The witchcraft case was less about magic and more about politics. It was the final weapon used against a woman who had already been pushed into isolation. She had lost her allies, lost her husband's affection, and now lost her last shred of protection. The empress, who once embodied virtue and stability, was branded a criminal, accused of dark arts in a palace that thrived on appearances. For Chen Jiao, the charges were not just humiliating, they were fatal. The fall of an empress is swift, brutal, and final. Once Emperor Wu accepted the accusations of witchcraft, the decree came with chilling speed. Chen Jiao was stripped of her title, her seal taken, her robes of state replaced with plain garments. The woman who had once been crowned with jade and silk now stood as a prisoner within the same palace that had once bowed to her. She was only 22 years old. The edict of deposition transformed her overnight. No longer Empress Chen, she became simply Chen Jiao, a disgraced noblewoman confined to isolation. Every privilege she had once enjoyed, servants, honors, respect, was erased. Courtiers who had once bowed deeply before her now avoided her gaze, fearful that association with her might drag them down as well. Accounts tell us she was placed under house arrest, watched carefully, denied the freedom even to plead her case. There was no trial, no chance to argue her innocence. The emperor's word was law, and the word had been spoken. For Chen Jiao, the humiliation was unbearable. The great halls of Weiyang Palace, which once echoed with her footsteps, now seemed like a tomb. She could hear the sounds of life continuing outside. Musicians playing for the emperor, officials discussing state affairs, concubines laughing as they paraded their children. But she herself was invisible, silenced, erased from court life as if she had never existed. The swiftness of her fall was a reminder to all the women of the harem. Power in the palace was as fragile as a paper lantern in the rain. No matter how high one climbed, a single misstep or a whisper of scandal could reduce everything to ashes. In Chen Jiao's case, the misstep had been her inability to bear a child, compounded by jealousy, loneliness, and the ruthless opportunism of her rivals. Witchcraft may have been the official charge, but the true crime in the emperor's eyes was failure. Failure to secure the dynasty's future, failure to hold his affection, failure to embody the image of an empress. What remained of her was a cautionary tale. At just 22, she had lived the dream of every noblewoman, married to the most powerful man in the land, crowned as Empress of the Han dynasty. And in an instant, it had all been taken away. Her story was no longer one of splendor, but of warning. That in the palace, love and power could vanish overnight, leaving only silence and shame. After her deposition, Chen Jiao was no longer the radiant empress who once commanded the imperial court. She became an outcast within the palace walls, tolerated only because of her former status, yet despised by those who once bowed before her. Isolation became her constant companion, and humiliation was her daily bread. Her attendants were reduced, and the few who remained treated her with cold efficiency rather than reverence. Gone were the silks and jewels that once adorned her. Now she wore plain robes, indistinguishable from those of a servant. In the rigid hierarchy of the Han court, appearance was everything, and to strip her of her regalia was to strip her of dignity. Worse still was the silence. The emperor no longer spoke her name, ministers avoided her, and even members of her once powerful Chen family distanced themselves in fear of political repercussions. In the treacherous world of the Han dynasty, association with a disgraced figure was as dangerous as the disgrace itself. The court used her fall as a warning. Stories of the former empress's downfall spread throughout the harem, whispered into the ears of young concubines and handmaidens. "Do not end up like her," they were told. "Do not fail to please the emperor. Do not fail to bear sons. Do not let jealousy destroy you." Chen Jiao, once a role model, was turned into a parable of shame. In these final years, or perhaps months, her world shrank to a suffocating chamber. She had no child to comfort her, no allies to defend her, and no husband to hear her pleas. The loneliness must have been crushing. She had been at the very center of the Han dynasty, surrounded by power and splendor, only to find herself reduced to nothing in less than a decade. What history calls disgrace was, for Chen Jiao, a slow death of spirit. Every day she lived was a reminder of what she had lost and what she would never regain. Her humiliation was not just political, it was deeply personal, eroding her identity until she became little more than a shadow, a ghost haunting the palace that once celebrated her. For the young concubines who heard her story, she was a warning. For the emperor, she was an inconvenience. And for herself, she was a tragic figure trapped in a cage, with only silence to echo her grief. When the Han court finally decided that Chen Jiao's existence posed more risk than worth, the verdict came swiftly and without ceremony. She would not be allowed to fade quietly into old age. She would drink poison. There was no trial, no chance to defend herself. The emperor's word was sufficient, and in the tightly controlled machinery of the Han dynasty, imperial command was absolute. For Chen Jiao, it was the final betrayal. Abandoned as a wife, dethroned as an empress, and now condemned without so much as a voice in her own fate. The order was delivered with chilling formality. An official arrived with the decree and a small vessel of poison, its surface glistening in the lamplight. To refuse would mean a more violent death, one that would leave her body broken and her name cursed. To drink was, paradoxically, the only way to preserve a shred of dignity. One imagines her in that final moment, seated in a chamber stripped of grandeur, her hands trembling as she lifted the cup. Perhaps she thought of her childhood, when she was groomed for greatness. Perhaps she thought of the promise of love and stability that had once seemed within reach. Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all, numbed by the inevitability of her fate. At 22, her life ended as quietly as it had begun, a young woman extinguished by the very system that had raised her up. The court records state only the fact. She drank poison and died. But facts cannot capture the silence of the chamber after she collapsed, the absence she left behind, or the bitterness of a destiny unfulfilled. Her death was not marked by grand funerals or public mourning. The empire moved on. A new empress would take her place. The rituals of court life would continue, and Chen Jiao's name would fade into the margins of history. Yet even in this silence, her story endured. Her poisoned cup became a symbol of how fragile a woman's life could be beneath the shadow of the throne. The empress who once embodied splendor and promise died alone, her youth stolen, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power. After Chen Jiao's death, the palace did not pause to mourn. The wheels of empire turned on, indifferent to the fate of a young woman whose existence had once defined the court. Within weeks, Emperor Wu appointed a new empress, restoring the ceremonial balance of the harem as if nothing had happened. The silence surrounding her death was deliberate. In the Han dynasty, the downfall of an empress was not a subject to be publicly debated. It was a shameful episode to be erased. Officials avoided her name in their reports. Chronicles recorded only the briefest details. She was deposed, she died. Her story was reduced to a cautionary footnote in the annals of the dynasty. And yet, beyond the walls of the court, whispers spread. In the markets of Chang'an, storytellers spoke of the young empress who had been forced to drink poison. Mothers warned their daughters about the dangers of envy and ambition in the palace. For common people, her tragedy became a parable about the cruelty of power and the fragility of women's lives under imperial rule. Meanwhile, inside the palace, her rivals thrived. Concubines who had once feared her now paraded openly, basking in the emperor's attention. A new hierarchy was established, and with it, the memory of Chen Jiao was pushed further into obscurity. She was not honored with shrines or memorials. She was not celebrated as a martyr. She was simply gone, replaced as swiftly as she had risen. This indifference was perhaps the harshest judgment of all. To be killed was one tragedy. To be forgotten was another. The Han dynasty could not afford to dwell on its discarded empress. The empire's stability demanded continuity, and continuity required silence. Yet her story lingered in the shadows. Every concubine who entered the palace knew her name, even if it was spoken only in whispers. Every empress who followed understood that her crown was fragile, that love and loyalty meant nothing without heirs. Chen Jiao's ghost haunted the court not through presence, but through absence. Her fate a warning carved into the collective memory of the harem. In the grand stage of the Han dynasty, she had played her part and been erased. But among the people, her story endured, echoing long after her body was gone. Chen Jiao's life was brief, her reign as empress even briefer. But the lessons drawn from her tragedy have outlasted centuries. She was only 22 when she died. Yet her story reflects universal truths about power, vulnerability, and the precarious position of women in imperial history. Her downfall was not merely the result of personal flaws, though historians often paint it that way. It was the consequence of a system designed to pit women against one another, to measure their worth solely by their ability to produce heirs, and to discard them once they failed. In such a system, even the most powerful empress was expendable. Chen Jiao's jealousy and desperation were human responses to inhuman pressures. She was crowned as a teenager, forced into a marriage that served politics more than love, and then judged relentlessly for failing to conceive. Surrounded by rivals, abandoned by her husband, and stripped of allies, she was trapped in a palace that magnified her every weakness and punished her every misstep. Her tragic end also reveals something about the emperor himself. Emperor Wu, celebrated as one of the greatest rulers of the Han dynasty, expanded China's borders and strengthened its culture. Yet in his private life, he discarded the woman who had once been crowned beside him without hesitation. For all his brilliance as a sovereign, his treatment of Chen Jiao exposed the ruthless coldness of absolute power. What remains of her today is not monuments or honors, but a lesson. A reminder that behind the glitter of imperial courts lay countless forgotten women whose lives were crushed by the weight of dynastic politics. Her story is part of a larger narrative, The countless empresses, consorts, and concubines who lived in gilded cages, celebrated in youth and silenced in disgrace. Chen Jiao's broken life challenges us to look beyond the surface of history. It reminds us that beneath every chronicle of emperors and battles lies the human cost, fragile lives sacrificed to sustain the machinery of empire. Her name may be little more than a footnote in official histories, but her tragedy continues to resonate. In her silence, we hear the echo of every woman who bore the crown only to be destroyed by it. And in her youth cut short, we are reminded that even in the most powerful dynasties, life at court was never a promise of safety, but a gamble with fate.